Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Mo Cunningham. I'm an associate professor of political science here in the Department of Political Science, and I am also a proud graduate of the University of Massachusetts at Boston. Yes. Boston's great public research university with a teaching soul. I stole his line. I won't be invited back for this again. Welcome to a conversation with the campus and Chancellor Motley, as a concluding focus for our spring enrichment and engagement days, wanted to have this conversation around the topic of civic virtue, public education, and democracy. So we'll hear some remarks from the Chancellor, and then we will have brief comments from my colleagues, Dean of College of Science and Math, Andrew Grosofsky, Associate Professor in the Department of Women's Studies, Elora Chowdhury, Professor Lynn Terrell of the Department of Philosophy, and Rajani Srikanth, Professor, Department of English, Associate Provost for Faculty Affairs, and Director of the Honors Program. We'll go to them directly after hearing from Chancellor Motley, but now let's get this conversation started by welcoming to the podium the 8th Chancellor of the University of Massachusetts at Boston, Keith Motley.
Good afternoon. I didn't know that Mo was a line stealer. You know, I love the fact that you came up here and you had that much nerve. But I'm so grateful that we're able to bring the classroom to you today. When we thought about this opportunity, we typically would come out and we would do a state of the university, which you are finding out about every day rapidly. And so we wanted to sort of get into a topic that was something that we could all have a conversation around. And I'm so grateful to be able to lead it off and to have some tremendous colleagues here and there that we can have this wonderful conversation with. And so we're going to talk about civic virtue, public education, and democracy. So in 1780, it was written that wisdom and knowledge, as well as virtue, diffuse generally among the body of the people, being necessary for the preservation of their rights and liberties, and as depend on spreading the opportunities and the advantages of education in the various parts of the country and among the different orders of people, it shall be the duty of legislators and magistrates to cherish the interest of literature and the sciences in all the seminaries of them. In 1785, it was written, the whole people must take upon themselves the education of the whole people and be willing to bear the expense of it. And be willing to bear the expense of it. There should not be a district of 1 mile square without a school in it, not funded or founded by the charitable individual, but maintained at the public expense of the people themselves. Now, these words spoken in 1780 and 1785, respectively, are the thoughts of no less a partner in the Constitution of this nation and an anxious and arduous defender of liberty than John Adams. It is clear from his writing, left to posterity, that he valued public education for its ability to inculcate intelligence and skill, to pass on technical capacities, to generate social mobility, and for its contribution to this nation's economy. In short, for its instrumental contributions. However, there is a surpassing concern that drives Adams' desire to see education made universally available and publicly funded. Adams was always concerned with the specter and tendencies within societies toward descent into tyranny in its various manifestations. Hence, he sought for the fledgling American nation, which he had just helped to construct, the cultivation of human virtue through education to preserve the liberties which remain the bedrock of a free society. Now, these virtues may be understood as inherent capabilities that reach beyond skill, technology, and craft. If allowed to do so, education can develop great discipline and work ethic that enhances one's productivity. Look at what it's done for our professor who's had this kind of education here. Yet I believe that it should also engender deep insight into human cultural, social, political, and spiritual being, which, when made available to folk of the many varying backgrounds and differences of this society, or what Adams refers to in his Thoughts of Government as the different orders of people, combats the establishment of a monopoly on ideas about truth, good, beauty, or human happiness by privileged individuals or groups in society. Liberty is preserved when the people inculcate capacities to examine human activity in its various spheres of existence and recognize historical patterns at work that marginalize or empower, exclude or include, obscure or clarify, that subjugate or liberate. When virtues such as these are cultivated and expressed publicly, I believe they have a multiplier effect upon the culture and the polity of a community and the nation. As idealistic as this appeal to virtue may sound, I believe it was at work in a very profound way in the most recent crisis visited upon our city, a city that is well known for its high concentration of people with higher education degrees. As the scenario unfolded and the information began to seep out regarding the Chechenian background of the suspects and the possibility that there have been ties to a Muslim religion, one noticed among Bostonians a strange kind of constraint to their comments regarding the suspects. While on a national level, there was a rush to judgment about connections to Al-Qaeda or Islamic militants, among Bostonians, there was a quiet, almost civic patience that was determined to allow the full story to unfurl before definite statements were made. And even when connections to a militant religious movement were established, the avoidance of stereotypes were established, the avoidance of some stereotypes or making broad statements about any group of people here in this community have prevailed and around this city, though it had been so deeply affected by this tragedy. And so, these virtues, powerful though they are, provide the civic background for the extraordinary qualities displayed by so many who responded bravely and also selfishly amidst the chaos following the explosions, who confronted the suspects in armed combat in the night, who provided leadership for our cities and our towns, even now in the aftermath of the crisis. I am proud to say that many of our students and so many of our alumni are among the many categories of civic leadership who have responded to this crisis. What we have seen in this subtle difference in emphasis associated with our city speaks powerfully to the ideal of public education that Adams spoke of. We have seen in our history how the hysteria generated in crisis has resulted in the curtailment of freedoms, closings of borders, and public painting of entire races, ethnicities, nationalities with suspicion. Thus far, Boston's response has focused on maintaining a free and an open community with negative suspicions directed most appropriately at the suspected perpetrators with a view toward understanding and prevention. This, my colleagues, is what expanded access to education can do, and I believe has done in our communities. We are by no means perfect, but I am suggesting that we have the experience and we've experienced the multiplier effect of the extension of education to a greater proportion of our community. It is why Adams sought the education of the whole people. We in public higher education are working to inculcate virtues that undergird a healthy democracy, beyond just the inclination to vote. For example, we seek to engender openness to the claims of others. We proclaim the value of inclusion even as we measure the consequences carefully. We hold to the belief in the wisdom of acting in behalf of the public interest. We hold as an article of faith that anyone, given the opportunity, can rise to great levels of achievement and contributions for the public good. This pursuit is a public enterprise meant to be directed toward all. This is not to negate the fine work being done by many private institutions in the Commonwealth and across the nation. However, a purely private enterprise always runs the risk of being unduly influenced by some private interests that may leave some segment of the whole people excluded. We recognize that providing exposure for the public to those civic virtues allows for the ongoing civic conversations necessary to preserve a healthy democracy. But I also note here Adams' insistence that the whole people must take upon themselves the education of the whole people and be willing to bear the expense of it. This suggests that a critical element of civic virtue is the willingness to share the benefits as well as the burden of public education. Citizenship, in our view, is both a privilege and a responsibility. Hence, to call for access, to demand excellence, and to require accountability, one must be willing to shoulder the burden of support. Otherwise, one is in danger of adopting the vice of seeking to get something for nothing. This is the foundation upon which my colleagues and I, who lead public higher education institutions, stand as we seek to push the Commonwealth to do more in this regard. At Boston's Public Research University, we embrace this noble responsibility to aid in the development of citizens who understand and appreciate the dearness and fragility of liberty in our communities, our Commonwealth, our nation, and our world. I do not think one can put a dollar figure to this dimension of our educational mission, and this may be the reason that this aspect is so undervalued in a culture which has become fixated on economic life. However, if we shrink from the responsibility to invest in these moral and intellectual assets, how comprehensive and far-reaching will be the bankruptcy that we experience as a culture, and how impoverished will our nation be? Our way of life, our sense of freedom, depends very heavily upon our shared understanding of what it is and what is good and what are the ends of authentic human life. While we may never arrive at full agreement, we will, as a proud public university, endeavor to keep the debate current, and we're going to keep the quality high of that debate. And so, at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, we both embrace and we extend the heritage of civic virtue in an ever-earnest pursuit of a more perfect union. I remain undaunted in my faith that this is the right time, that this is the right place, and we together are the right people to undertake this lofty endeavor. As I stated on many occasions, we are the University of Massachusetts, Boston, but I have never, ever, ever been prouder to be your chancellor. Thank you, and I can't wait to hear from our colleagues and to get this conversation going. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chancellor Motley, and we will get our conversation started with remarks from our panelists from the faculty, and I think we'll just go from Dean Wysocki down to professors sitting to the left of him.
It's going to be easy. I hope nobody will mind if I stand. I think it'll be easier. Thank you.
Pull that down if you want.
Yeah, there we go. I'm a little shorter than the Chancellor. Thank you, Chancellor. And I wanted to start by thanking Chancellor Motley for the invitation to join him here today in this discussion. You know, I was provided a copy of the remarks in advance, and I was really taken by them. I thought it was a fascinating connection that was being made between the thinking of our founders, particularly John Adams, about public education and the obligations of society to support public education to achieve a public good. And the way that played out in the recent events, tragic events that we experienced here in Boston and the response of the city, I just was really taken with those remarks, and I thank him for that. And it got me thinking about public education, which for the purposes of my brief comments will mean education that's funded by and offered through governmental entities. And contrast that with universal education of the citizenry, which is really now accomplished through a mixture of public and private secular institutions, as well as religiously affiliated institutions. And the questions I had was, are these simply differentiated by the people who bear the burden of the expense, or I think it's true that they're more significantly differentiated additionally by their purpose and by their mission? And can a mixture of educational institutions with different financial supporters and different missions achieve the broad public good which was envisioned by John Adams and which has just been articulated by Chancellor Motley? So what are the purposes of universal education? I think it includes advancement of individual knowledge, experience, understanding and tolerance, and appreciation of the arts and the sciences as broadly and most classically understood. And as the Chancellor has emphasized, an educated citizenry is the product of such a universal education, and they can uphold and foster liberty, democracy, and the virtues of a free, diverse, multicultural, and vibrant society. Now, more recently, we hear greater emphases on additional purposes, such as supporting individual aspirations for personal achievement and growth, including career aspirations, development of a capable and globally competitive workforce which drives societal economic well-being, and quite significantly in this day and age, we have research universities, which I don't think existed in John Adams' times, or certainly were not structured as such. They can be public or private, and they provide top-tier venues for education of their students. These institutions, such as UMass Boston, are distinguished by an emphasis on knowledge discovery, not only knowledge dissemination. And this expands the horizons of human understanding, but also drives innovation and the creation of new industries, and to some extent that's very intentional. At UMass Boston, as we know, we are Boston's only public research university. The purposes of universal education in our Commonwealth and in our city, as envisioned by our founders and as developed into the 21st century, depend on our campus's development in an important way. Our public purpose is different than our counterparts. I don't need to tell this audience about the many, many stories we have of brilliant students who come to UMass Boston as their opportunity for higher education in a research university. They deserve educational opportunities which are comparable to or better than the best of the privates. I'm sure John Adams would agree with that perspective. Without our growing presence and contribution, and despite the unbelievable constellation of private institutions that are in our neighboring vicinity, the broad purposes of universal education, as discussed here today, could not be achieved. UMass Boston is essential for that purpose. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. You can pull it down to that next level.
Yeah. Like here? Thank you, Chancellor Motley, for inviting me to participate in this discussion on May Day. My response today is rather personal and perhaps not as optimistic as the Chancellor, as I come to you with a heavy heart given the deeply sad and enraging events of the last 2 weeks. Here I'm referring not only to the Boston Marathon bombing and surrounding events leading to 5 deaths and 260 injured, but also to the fertilizer plant explosion in West Texas, leading to 15 deaths and 150 injured, and to the worst known disaster in the global garments industry, which took place in Savar, Bangladesh on April 24th, killing 400 plus workers and injuring hundreds more. While these 3 events may not appear to have a connection, I believe in a discussion about civic virtue, where the Chancellor has so rightly called for a commitment to whole people, our education system needs to foster a worldview that embraces human connectivity, pluralism, and democracy. I want to reiterate my response today is personal. In addition to being an educator at UMass Boston, I am also a Muslim American, a recent immigrant from Bangladesh, and a mother of 2 young boys. In the immediate aftermath of the tragic explosions in Boston, much confusion and discussion ensued over whether this attack should be classified as terrorism, whether the brothers acted to further certain political or social objectives. Commentators have noted over the last 2 years, the U.S. has witnessed at least 4 other episodes of mass indiscriminate violence that in each instance killed more people than the Boston bombings did. And they're referring to the Tucson shooting by Jared Luffner, the Aurora movie theater shooting by James Holmes, the Sandy Hook Elementary shooting by Adam Lanza, and Wade Michael Page, a veteran of the U.S. Army, shot and killed 6 in a Sikh temple in Oak Creek, Wisconsin in August 2012. The word terrorism was almost never used to describe that indiscriminate slaughter of innocent people, and none of the perpetrators of those attacks was charged with terrorism-related crimes. Glenn Greenwald stated in an article in The Guardian that in today's world, terrorism does not have any real meaning other than a Muslim who commits violence against America and its allies. So as soon as a Muslim commits violence, there is an automatic decree that it is terrorism, even though no such assumption arises from similar acts committed by non-Muslims. At the same time, discussions featuring prominent members of the Muslim American community have been defensive, uncritically nationalistic, calling for guilt, acknowledgement, and responsibility from within the community. There is news of a Boston mosque's refusal to bury Tamerlan Tsarnaev. In a personal conversation, a friend who is an American Muslim immigrant says she will not take her children to mosques in fear of exposure to constructed ideology of Islam, and that she has changed names of her children so they will not be associated with the religion of Islam. I have been searching for a response that is respectful to people's faith and promotes civic engagement. Upon learning the identity of the Tsarnaev brothers, President Obama asked, why did young men who grew up and studied here as part of our communities and our country resort to such violence? I want to take this question seriously and further ask, what drives young men in our society to respond to feelings of disempowerment, alienation, being a misfit by committing mass murder? How are we as a society enabling this type of behavior? Are we fostering a culture that promotes, valorizes, even rewards militarized masculinity? In the same week of the Boston bombing, 15 people died in a chemical plant explosion in the West Texas. Just a few of the 4,500 Americans killed each year on the job. Richard Kim in The Nation wrote that if we cared to probe further, we'd discover that OSHA hadn't inspected the plant in 28 years, that the company that owns the plant might have violated safety regulations, as it had last year in another facility, that we might even call the explosion criminal negligence and attribute culpability, but would we ascribe ideology, and which ideology would we indict? Deregulation, austerity, or capitalism? And could we name profit as that motive in the same way that we might name, say, Islam as the motive for terrorism? A week later, on April 24th, a day after Bangladeshi authorities asked the owners to evacuate their garment factory that employed 3,000 workers, the building collapsed. Rescue workers were able to save 2,000 and over people, with confirmation of 400 plus dead. Images of broken bodies, rubble, and civilian rescue workers with labels like Joe Fresh, Children's Place, and Benetton dangling from their hands. This case is testimony to the effects of globalization. The lesson here is that there is ultimately no accountability in the global economy. How can working in the global market mean you lose your inalienable human rights to safety? How then can the human rights of global export workers be assured? West Texas, Savar are not accidents. Neither should they be presumed the cost of living in a modern industrialized economy. In conclusion, I don't have a coherent way to neatly tie all of these reflections together, but I want to simply say at this conversation on public education that we commit to thinking of our communities as local and global and as interconnected, to think in terms of human connectivity and inherent dignity of human beings, to think of our institutions as not profit-driven, nor adhering to a culture of fear and violence, and resist impulses towards selective responsibility and empathy.
In these remarks, there are a few times when I say you, and it sounds like I'm speaking to students. But I want you to know, I actually mean everyone, because what I'm saying can happen for students actually happened for me as well when I came to UMass Boston, having already been a professor at another august university. So what happens for students happens for faculty as well. So thank you, Chancellor, and the panel for this important discussion. Yes, every person of any social or economic group deserves access to the collected wisdom of the ages and the tools of inquiry that allow us each to choose our own paths into the future. Access to excellence matters because education helps us to be autonomous agents who determine the course of our own lives. We learn better, more widely, and more deeply if we learn in company, carrying on conversations with great minds throughout our lives. The Roman philosopher Seneca urges us to study great works. He says, "By the toil of others we are led into the presence of things which have been brought from darkness into light. We are excluded from no age, but we have access to them all. And if we are prepared in loftiness of mind to pass beyond the narrow confines of human weakness, there is a long period of time through which we can roam. We can argue with Socrates, express doubt with Carneades, cultivate retirement with Epicurus, overcome human nature with the Stoics, and exceed its limits with the Cynics. update this thought to the present, and spread it across the world. With the amazing education you can receive at a diverse public institution like UMass Boston, you can learn from people of many times, cultures, faiths, and places. Their challenges to your beliefs should be welcomed. Consider John Stuart Mill's question in his classic On Liberty. Mill asks, in the case of any person whose judgment is really deserving of confidence, how has it become so? He answers, because he has felt that the only way in which a human being can make some approach to knowing the whole of a subject is by hearing what can be said about it by persons of every variety of opinion, and studying all the modes in which it can be looked at by every character of mind. No wise man ever acquired his wisdom in any mode but this, nor is it in the nature of human intellect to become wise in any other manner. Now, if I were saying this today, I would include women. I wouldn't just say wise men. I think wise women know this too. The life of the mind that you can develop in a diverse and open learning community like UMass Boston is second to none. Your ideas will be tested and challenged, often but not always supportively, and you will gain strength and confidence as you continue to research and explore your whole life long. We learn not only from theories, but also from each other, and carry that forward as citizens in our communities, as shapers of the world of tomorrow. Chancellor Motley is right to remind us of the multiplier effect of the virtues we cultivate here, and their significance, in his words, to the culture and polity of a community and the nation. Our diversity is an asset, and if we do not protect access, we will lose a significant measure of our excellence. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me in the back? Okay, thank you. I want to thank Chancellor Motley for inviting me to speak this afternoon, and I want to thank you, my colleagues, my students, my friends, for being here. I'll talk today about contradictions. Each of us is full of contradictions. We are both arrogant and humble, nervous and confident, generous and small-minded, rigid in our thinking and open to new ideas, all at the same time. A university, a classroom, recognizes these contradictions as the very essence of a meaningful and engaged life, because these contradictions remind us of the complexity of every individual and, by extension, of communities and of nations. Universities and classrooms deal in complexities. We seek complexity, we examine it, and we add to our understanding about human nature, about cultures, about peoples, about the institutions that people create out of these contradictions and complexities. An exchange student from China recently said to me, "The United States is full of contradictions." And she made this perceptive statement as a relative newcomer who was able to see this country with eager new eyes and with a desire to drink in all that she was experiencing. As a nation, we are capable of great generosity, but also of unthinking hostility. We celebrate the uniqueness of each individual, but we also rush to reduce certain individuals to simplistic labels and categories. For the United States, as a country, being aware of our contradictions and our complexities is a necessary first step toward negotiating among their competing pull on our impulses, and then acting in responsible ways with thoughtful empathy and with recognition of our global power and privilege. For each of us as individuals, as leaders of institutions, the same awareness of the complexities within us is crucial, particularly in moments of crisis. There are students on our campus right now who are feeling extremely vulnerable that they will be read in particular ways as undesirable and dangerous. How do we, deliberately or unintentionally, contribute to their sense of deep unease? What will it take for each of us to create an atmosphere on our campus where all our students and faculty and staff feel that they belong? The desire to belong is powerful and it is basic. Those of us who are fortunate enough to feel anchored in our communities and neighborhoods, who have no doubt that we are welcomed and embraced, for us, it is only through an act of active imagination that we can understand what it feels like to be unwelcome, to be viewed with suspicion, to be always positioned as the outsider. And I'm reminded here about Richard Wright, the famous African-American writer of the mid-1950s, who said that every person, in order to connect with another, has to engage in an act of significant living. A deep, deep connection to those who are most unfamiliar to us can only come from entering into their muscles, into their minds, into their bones to understand what they're feeling. And here is where a university plays an urgent role. In our classrooms, through the subjects we study, through the discussions we have, each of us is encouraged to step outside our own zones of comfort and to come face to face with unfamiliar and perhaps uncomfortable ideas. And it is in the sacred and safe place of a classroom, and I repeat the word sacred place of a classroom, that we come to the realization that we are all outsiders to some extent, because we are all on an endless journey of self-discovery and discovery about others. And the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben said, it is only when every single one of us knows what it's like to be a refugee, knows what it's like to be displaced, can we understand what it means to be human. I'll end with a powerful and deeply moving observation made by one of my students, and he's here in this room, and I want to thank him. He said, we usually think of emotions such as doubt and uncertainty as indicators of weakness. But doubt and uncertainty are actually evidence of an active mind, and evidence of a mind that is not closed to new influences. The absence of doubt and uncertainty can result in people feeling that they know all there is to know about a situation or a person, and it can lead to their never stopping to assess the consequences of their actions. For this student, doubt and uncertainty are desirable states of mind that we should all seek to achieve because they keep us humble, remind us of our and others' vulnerability, and prevent us from becoming fixed and complacent in our thinking. The wonder of a university is that it is, and it has the capacity to be, that space where doubt and uncertainty become the powerful motivating forces of inquiry, discovery, and continuous learning about the physical and natural worlds, the social and cultural, economic and political worlds, and the creative and expressive worlds in which we struggle to shape our common humanity. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the Chancellor and each of my colleagues for their thoughtful presentations and remind you all that this is a conversation and we're about to turn questions over to you. I want to make one little point of my own that the Chancellor began with a quote from John Adams. It's from the Massachusetts State Constitution that John Adams wrote in 1780, this portion on the value of education. And this is how he ends up that passage on the value of education. This is what we're expected to get out of education here. It's for the promotion of agriculture, arts, sciences, commerce, trades, manufactures, and a natural history of the country, to countenance and inculcate the principles of humanity and general benevolence, public and private charity, industry and frugality, honesty and punctuality in their dealings, sincerity, good humor, and all social affections, and generous sentiments among the people. I teach that every year to my students in Massachusetts politics, and I have to tell you, I always say that is a heavy load for education to carry, but it can do it. Adams believed in it, and we believe in it. And with that, let me turn it over to your questions to the Chancellor or to any of the panelists. We have something?
Statements.
I've been feeling really emotional in the last few weeks, and so I want to be able to say what I have to say in a way that's both succinct and isn't going to lead me to start weeping, which I have wanted to do often in the last couple of weeks. I come from a family of immigrants who was lucky to have papers. We were able to leave the Russian-Polish border, but only because the papers fell the right way and got to Cuba. And from Cuba to the United States, we were lucky to get the right papers so that we could get here. I have stopped using the word citizenship, although it is a word that's a very powerful one, because in a post-9/11 environment with the militarization of immigration services, we have turned the word citizenship into something that excludes not just individuals in our communities without papers, but the many students and individuals on this campus who know somebody who is afraid because they could be incarcerated and forgotten in an ICE prison at any time. We have been advocates in my research team of having students do research on the kinds of environments that create resilience and success, both in education and in mental health for many people. And one of the things that I want us to become aware of is how many messages of not belonging we give even to the generation born here when we tell them that my students of color are constantly asked the question, not just where are you from, but what are you? And those questions, along with the threat of a distinction between the human beings who belong among us, who can work our dirty jobs but don't have any other human rights, is something that affects this very diverse student body. And so I just wanted to ask my academic colleagues who maybe know something about an alternative vocabulary, is there some way we can talk about civic engagement that does not use a word that is so divisive and that tells us who does and who does not belong in our society?
Esther, you ask a really, as you know, a really complicated question. And my response would be that, yes, there's a lot of, I mean, here again is another sort of contradiction. People tend to seek sort of some comfort in national identities, and at the same time, we know that national identity can be one of the most divisive forms of identity, right? So the whole notion of a nation state is, of course, open to question. And people, you know, how do you negotiate between this desire to have a kind of open, borderless world in which we recognize our common humanities and understand that an action that we take here in the US affects someone 10,000 miles away, and in that sense, we are actually completely connected. So how do we take that knowledge and yet also weigh it against the ways in which from the moment we are born, we are socialized to think of ourselves as being part of a nation? I would say that is one of the hardest dilemmas that we have to engage. And I completely agree with you that using the word citizenship, we automatically exclude so many people who don't have that. And yet, these are the people who make our lives possible, right? Who do the work that needs to be done. And the sense of sort of carving borders is perhaps a human desire to demarcate spaces that we understand, but it's also something that we have to consistently be questioning and interrogating. I don't have an answer to your question at all. I can't think of what other category we might use, but this is why I find someone like Agamben so useful, because he says we really all have to think of ourselves as displaced people and as refugees, because only then can we understand what it means to be cast out of this community of citizens.
Hi. I don't have any answers. In fact, I'm going to kind of do the professorial thing, which is a reference, because right here on our campus, Michaela Perina in the philosophy department works on the very issue of inclusion, exclusion, and concepts of citizenship. And I agree with Rajani that it's so complicated, and I agree with the premises of your question so much that when I was looking for ways to make what I said fit within our 2-minute time limit, looking for words to cut out, I cut out every reference to the word citizen. I cut that word completely out of my remarks. On the other hand, I think citizenship is something not to be ashamed of. It's something to be embraced. I was with my research assistant from UMass Boston when he became a U.S. citizen at Fenway Park, and it was a really joyous day for him. But he didn't think it gave him the license to be nasty or rude to people who hadn't gone through that process. And I think Mo could help me with this, but isn't it the 14th Amendment that isn't just about citizenship, but about anyone within the territories is guaranteed equal protection?
I think that's
and
correct, yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah, that's
and
correct.
so I feel like we have to really take that to heart. You want to say something about that?
No, I think it's well said, but I think it raises a slightly different question to me, which is something I've been working on with my students on in the Lincoln course that I teach, which is a July 4th, 1861 message to Congress. And Lincoln says of the conflict that all republics face this great question: can they be strong enough to prevail over internal conflict and yet respectful enough of the liberties of their citizens to be free? And that is part of the conflict that we are all trying to resolve, and that is probably unanswerable in some way, on some level. Yes, we have a...
Thank you. Well, I'm Dave Magnani. I'm in the Advancement Office. I just want to thank you, Chancellor, for hosting this forum. It was 1993 when we passed the Education Reform Act in Massachusetts. And the conversation about what should be included in terms of the fundamental premises of that act were very much being debated at the time. And we created something called the MCAS, and we narrowed it down to math and science. And we focused on math and science. And the bill was largely written by business leaders and by lawyers. There were no teachers in the room. And what struck me about this conversation is that the qualities of good citizenship, when you begin to think about them, are so well matched to social and economic prosperity that we don't really need to create economic prosperity as the fundamental premise for education. We can use citizenship as the fundamental premise for education. Because if you begin to look at all of the various skills, attitudes, competencies that are required for an effective citizen within a democracy, you begin to look at critical thinking. You begin to look at cultural awareness. You begin to look at mathematical and scientific competence. You begin to look at all of those things that are necessary for us to be profoundly effective as citizens in the United States. Yesterday we had an election with 12% turnout. I don't know what that says about how successful our education system has been, but I would guess that very few of us look back at those result yesterday and say, that's a failure of our educational system. And yet, in many ways, civic engagement is really and should be the central defining characteristic and motivation for our education system. My question is this: does anyone on the panel have any ideas about how we can shift the dialogue that has emerged over the last 25 or 30 years that makes education an economic enterprise rather than an intellectual one?
It's on. It's on? Okay. Well, that's a good question. I'm going to, I'm still formulating a response, but I want to say a couple of things. One is, I have never been in an institution in my life which is more effective at developing a broad, diverse citizenship than UMass Boston. I mean, just look around us. I mean, I've never, we can't we can't do it immediately for perhaps all of society, and there were certain examples that were being discussed. I've never been in an institution which is more embracing of a tremendously diverse group of people and forming a truly integrated community, which sort of affirms the citizenship that everybody has in this community. I think it's wonderful. That's sort of the thing that came to my mind in terms of some of these other comments. But in terms of this separation between, or I made a few comments about this in my remarks about the research university, its very intentional purpose of developing innovation, economic development, workforce, pragmatic purposes. And I think that I guess I wouldn't completely agree that that's entirely separable from the development of the intellectual side of the students and the faculty who are participating in those kinds of programs. I think that it can get a little bit out of balance at times. But I think that, when done right, I do feel that it is a very exciting and very intellectual venture that is completely compatible, in my estimation, of the greatest traditions of academic research. Having said that, I think that one has to, sort of watch the balance. Maybe it can tip a little too far over in some times. And that's probably the best answer I can give. It is a good question, and it's a tough question. Thank you.
Yeah, can I just respond to what you asked, David? I actually agree that, I wouldn't want to separate those two kinds of education, because, and I'm speaking about that as someone who grew up in India and came here when I was 19. So when India got her independence, the first thing that the then Prime Minister focused on was how to educate the citizens or the people of India economically so that they would become economically productive. So, engineers, doctors, technicians, and those are the kinds of emphases that were placed, because there was this sort of decision made that to educate somebody in, the deep philosophical, reflective thought that makes you a participating citizen, somehow that's kind of a luxury, and we had to take care of the business of a new nation, which is building and moving forward. But now, more than 50 years later, there's this recognition that what we have are people so driven by an economic need that they don't understand the ways in which they're beholden to one another to create a community. And that comes from the other kinds of education, I think. So that's all.
I want to just add one little thing. My discipline is philosophy. And the American Philosophical Association has T-shirts and mugs for sale that say, "Philosophy, I'm in it for the money." Yeah, so obviously no one goes into philosophy for the money. Our very name means love of wisdom, but we are never really seen as economic engines. Just the same, I don't want to get into a kind of tug of war between science and math, or as it's now called STEM, right, versus the arts and humanities. But I do want more recognition for the social, cultural capital that the arts and humanities develop. And in particular, I want to highlight that there's a stereotype of STEM fields that's just training. And really what the teachers there are doing is making complex widgets. You know, people who can do this complicated thing and do it over and over again till they retire and move to Miami or something. And that's a stereotype. And of course, people learn skills and they learn how to do complicated things, but the best science and math training and technology training is also encouraging free thinking and creative thinking, because the people who are doing the teaching know that we need the young minds or older minds going back into those fields to be pushing the boundaries of knowledge there too. So for me, it's really about, are you making widgets, human widgets, or are you making free and creative thinkers? And philosophy, we get a good rap for doing that because no one can see the material value of what we do. But I want to, just give some props to people in science and math and say, I think many of them and the best of them are doing that too.
So, listen, I see a lot of cupcakes back there, and I see some fruit too. And so let's go back, let's have some more conversations back in the back of the room. And I know you'll be texting your friends and tell them there's all kinds of cupcakes downstairs. So get them down here too so we can eat them up. All right, thank you. And thank you to this panel, this great panel, and to our great professor for doing this, and graduate. Thank you, man. Thank you. Thank you. I love